What happened when Arthur Conan Doyle got to play Sherlock Holmes and not just write him? Margalit Fox joins us to talk about her new book, Conan Doyle for the Defense. What are the best thrillers to read this summer? My colleague Tina Jordan will be here to talk about the latest and greatest in crime, mystery, thrillers, and general intrigue. Plus, our critics Dwight Garner, Paul Siegel, and Jen Salai will join us to talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Margalit Fox joins us now. Her new book is called Conan Doyle for the Defense, the true story of a sensational British murder, a quest for justice, and the world's most famous detective writer. Margot, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So we're going to talk a bit about this book, also about your previous work for The Times as one of our great obituary writers, and you've only just left to focus on narrative nonfiction books. But we'll start with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So tell us about the story at the center of this book.
The story at the center of the book is a true crime story of murder, wrongful conviction, and the personal investigation of the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Just before Christmas in 1908 in Glasgow, Scotland, a wealthy, reclusive 82-year-old woman named Marion Gilchrist was found brutally murdered in her elegant Glasgow flat. The police very quickly settled upon a suspect, Arthur Slater, a 36-year-old German Jewish immigrant who was reported to earn his living as a gambler. Although the police learned within a week that Slater could not possibly have committed the crime, he was just the type of person they wanted to run out of their city anyway. So they framed him, they coached witnesses, they suborned perjury, they suppressed exculpatory evidence, and in the spring of 1909, Oscar Slater was convicted and sentenced to hang. He missed the gallows by 48 hours in an incident that still gives me chills. He had made arrangements for his own burial and could hear the scaffold being erected outside his cell. There was enough public unease about the conviction, however, that 2 days before he was sentenced to die, his death sentence was commuted to life at hard labor. He spent the next 18 and a half years breaking up enormous blocks of granite at a God-forsaken Victorian hell house of a prison in northern Scotland. He eventually smuggles out a message to Arthur Conan Doyle, who, besides being a crime fiction writer, is passionately interested in true crime and in social justice. Conan Doyle's personal reinvestigation of Oscar Slater's conviction wins Slater his freedom after 18 and a half years.
Wow. Okay. Let's scroll back 18 and a half years or even more to the scene of the crime, because Marion Gilchrist, as you mentioned, was a wealthy woman, and yet she was not fully robbed of her valuables at the time of her death.
That's the striking thing. When police interviewed Miss Gilchrist's maid on the night of the murder, Gilchrist kept the equivalent of almost $500,000 in today's American money in jewelry hidden in strange places around her flat, pinned behind curtains, tucked under carpets, things like that. But the maid said, despite that, only a single piece was missing, a crescent-shaped brooch set with diamonds. And woe betide Oscar Slater, by pure coincidence, he had pawned a crescent-shaped diamond brooch just at around that time, and that was all the pretext the police needed to arrest him, railroad him, convict him, and nearly hang him, even though they knew within about 5 days of the murder that the brooch Slater had pawned was entirely different from the one missing from the crime scene.
So who was Oscar Slater, and what made him such a useful victim here?
Well, Oscar Slater was the platonic form for what the great historian Peter Gay called the convenient other. He was vastly different from the majority culture, the culture in power at that time, or perhaps at any time.
Mm-hmm.
He was foreign. He was a Jew at a time in the first decade of the 20th century of heightened anti-Semitism and heightened anti-immigrant sensibilities.
This is in the UK.
This is in
England.
the UK,
Mm-hmm.
in England, but also then in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was the ideal scapegoat in a climate of fear, uncertainty, the jarring feeling that modernity was giving people who had been used to, in the Victorian era, the certainties of God, Queen, and country, and those were being questioned and being disrupted. So it was a time of great social unease, and in such times, cultures look for a scapegoat.
And what made him come under suspicion? Was it that the police had tapped into all of the pawn shops in the area? Like, how did he end up being accused of this crime?
It was that, but it was something even more nefarious that happened before Miss Gilchrist's murder, before, in other words, Oscar Slater had ever heard the name Marion Gilchrist. When Slater arrived in Glasgow in the autumn of 1908, about 6 weeks or so before the murder, he was already known to police. He had lived there once or twice before in the very first years of the 20th century. And again, he was the poster child for the kind of man they wanted to run out of town. Foreign, Jewish, low class, a gambler of dubious livelihood. He occupied this kind of demi-monde that frightened and horrified the bourgeois classes. So the police had their eye on Oscar Slater well before the murder. And as was proved, partly through Conan Doyle's work, they simply took this man that they wanted to get out of their city and rolled him into a high-profile murder that they were under pressure to close anyway.
All right. So how do the police get away with this? I mean, what is the state of detecting and police investigation in Scotland at that time?
Nothing like what we think of from our many TV forensic shows as being the state of detection today. What we would consider to be modern investigative forensics with state-of-the-art science, high-functioning police laboratories, impressive protocols that everyone follows. That kind of criminal forensics did not even begin to come into its own until the 1930s and 1940s. So one of the great, great tragedies of the Oscar Slater case is, had this whole thing happened 25 or 30 years later, it might have produced a very different outcome, and one that would be much healthier and better for Slater. At this time, however, the investigation of criminal cases was at a watershed moment in history. Just starting to emerge, and still really decades in the future, were these modern techniques. Without those to really avail themselves of, the Glasgow police and prosecutors fell back on a time-honored Victorian way of targeting criminals, which was to target first, ask questions later, and surprise, surprise, the person you target is going to be substantially different from you. A different nationality, a different social class, a different religion.
Was detective fiction sort of ahead of actual detective science at that time?
Sherlock Holmes himself certainly was. And in fact, as I discuss in the book, a number of things that we take for granted in criminal investigation today and for decades, things like the use of footprints, the analysis of dust traces, the analysis of cigarette and cigar ash, those are owed directly to the Sherlock Holmes stories. And when smart police departments around the world read those stories, they seized on those methods and adopted them.
Where was Arthur Conan Doyle in his career at this time? How well known was he? How widely read was he? Like, was he a public figure at the time? of the actual crime?
Conan Doyle was born in 1859, and the first Sherlock Holmes stories were published in the late 1880s. So by 1908, the time of the Gilchrist murder, he was one of the most celebrated and influential men, not only in Britain, but in the world.
And so what got him interested in this case? How did he become aware of it? And was he so influential and well-known that you had prisoners sort of writing him letters all the time saying, help me out?
Members of the public absolutely wrote Conan Doyle letters asking him to solve real-life mysteries, deaths, disappearances, and so on. And Conan Doyle, as the book explains, took on a number of those cases, personally investigated them using Holmesian methods, and indeed solved a number of them. There's one disappearance from a London hotel where he actually was able to pinpoint why the man had disappeared and where he had gone. Another was a murder that the police had not been able to solve for 4 or 5 years. He knew, simply based on hearing a narrative of the crime, where this murder victim's body was buried. He got involved in the Oscar Slater case in 1912, so about 3 years after the initial conviction. At the behest of Oscar Slater's lawyers, he reinvestigated the case, wrote a scathing indictment of the conduct of police and prosecutors, published in 1912, but there was still such high public sentiment against Slater, and the murder was still so fresh. It had been one of the most sensational, high-profile murders in remotely recent British history, that even notwithstanding Conan Doyle's lucid dismantling of the case, nothing could be done, and Slater remained where he was. So Slater kept breaking up granite and being served thin broth and gruel day in and day out. Then in 1925, Slater manages to smuggle a message, and I've seen it. I've actually held it. It's written on a fragment of brown tissue paper. He gave it to a fellow convict who was his friend, a man named William Gordon, who was being paroled in January 1925. And God bless him, William Gordon wore dentures. So Slater rolled this message into a tiny pellet, pinched a piece of glazed paper from the prison's bookbinding shop, rolled it around the message to keep it dry, popped it under Gordon's dentures, and although prison officials made a thorough search of Gordon on releasing him, it didn't occur to anyone to examine his gums.
I don't know how excited I would have been about touching this particular piece of paper, Margot.
Well, thank goodness for the piece of glazed paper. And by the time I saw it, of course, it was archivally preserved in acetate, so I didn't actually get to have William Gordon's century-old saliva on my fingers. But the message says, go see Conan Doyle. And William Gordon did. Conan Doyle was moved to take up the case again. And this time, enough time had elapsed and enough momentum gathered in support of Slater that in late 1927, after 18 and a half years in prison, Slater walked out of the gates a free man.
All right, let's talk about his reinvestigation of the case, because he started that 3 years, as you said, after the conviction. But what was available to him to investigate? Was the Glasgow police required to keep meticulous paperwork? Was that paperwork public? How could he go and reinvestigate what they had done?
Relatively little was public, and of course the crime scene itself was long gone. So Conan Doyle investigated the case in the way he knew best, in the way his most famous creation would have done, through rigorous logic. He got as much paperwork as he could. There were trial transcripts. That he had some sympathetic journalists working as his legmen, getting him witness statements, and eventually he was able to get some suppressed materials, but by no means all. But simply by combing the record that was there for the taking, he found all sorts of inconsistencies in witnesses changing their testimony. He found the suppression of exculpatory evidence. For instance, it was known by then that one of Slater's neighbors, on the night that Slater was supposed to have committed the murder, raced out into the streets of Glasgow like a madman and woven up and down the streets to evade capture before plunging into the Glasgow subway and escaping by riding out of town. The night he was supposed to have done that, one of Slater's neighbors saw him standing on his own doorstep right around that time, calmly smoking. And it was clear that that would have been a superb alibi for Slater. The police and prosecutors knew of this neighbor's testimony. He was never called at trial. It was suppressed. So Conan Doyle found all sorts of examples like that of real malfeasance.
So this is like a story within a story within a story within a story, right? You have the original crime. You have the story created around that crime by the police at the time. You have then the reinvestigation by Conan Doyle, then the story that happens after the conviction, and then again, his reinvestigation. And of course, you have the story of you coming across this story and then writing up. How did you become interested in it?
That itself is indeed a story. I first came upon this case more than 30 years ago when I had first come to New York after graduate school. I was working at an uninspiring entry-level job in book publishing and riding the subway to work one day. The book I had brought with me was John Dixon Carr's biography of Conan Doyle. It was published in 1949. And toward the end of the book, almost as an aside, Carr casually says something like, "Oh, by the way, Sir Arthur also personally investigated a real-life wrongful conviction for murder and had this poor Jewish immigrant freed after almost 20 years in prison." And I almost dropped the book on the middle of the A train. Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of the most famous fictional detective in the world, had successfully investigated a real-life murder. I thought, why on earth wasn't this case better known? And as I would discover, every Conan Doyle biography, and there are probably dozens, has anywhere from a paragraph to a chapter on the Slater case. But in America, anyway, there are no freestanding books on the case, and there are relatively few in Britain. It just seems to be something that fell into a crevice in history. Now, 30 years ago, I was not in a position to do anything about it. I had not even gone to journalism school yet, much less.
What did you go into graduate school for?
Linguistics.
Okay.
So not much help in this case, although fascinating in its own right. And so I filed it away in the back of my brain. And then in 2013, when my previous book, The Riddle of the Labyrinth, came out and I was casting about for something to do, there was the Oscar Slater story still in that corner of what Holmes calls the brain attic. And I thought, aha, I'm finally in a position to tell this story.
So your day job, until very recently, was as a writer on the obituary desk. You're also a previous staffer at the Book Review. Was there any way in which that work at the Times on obituaries sort of helped in writing this book?
Absolutely. The best line on what an obituary writer does came from one of my sisters who is a poet, and she loves to enter flash fiction contests where you have to write a whole novel in 100 words. I think it's completely nuts, but she likes it. She called me up.
But it's really the same thing in a way as what
Exactly.
Okay.
She called me up in the newsroom one day just to say hello, and when I picked up the phone, she said, "So, how's the flash biography business coming?" Mm-hmm. And I thought, my God, it took a poet to make me understand deeply what it is I do. And so Conan Doyle for the Defense, which is in a sense a partial biography, both of Conan Doyle and of Slater himself, who had by and large been lost to history. These book-length biographies are just the 1,000-word bios that we do every day in obits, gridded up about 100 times.
Here on the podcast, on the Book Review podcast, an ongoing theme is something we call the obit read, which is not about reading obituaries, but about reading books after having read obituaries. And I will often fold up the obit that caused me to or led me to read a book and put it in the book itself. And then I come upon it years later. And I think the first time I did this was with the Times's full page, now very rare, but full page biography of William Maxwell, which led me directly to They Came Like Swallows. So I have to ask, for you on the obits desk, did that happen to you where you sort of were constantly picking up books because you had written the obits or read other people's obits?
Well, we on Obits have the hyped-up caffeinated speed version of that, where especially for breaking news obits, daily obits written on deadline like any other story in the paper, where we don't have an advance obit on file for person X. If it is someone who's produced a lot of books, obviously if the piece has to be filed in 6 hours or 4 hours or 1 hour, we can't sit there and read his or her body of work. So you speed read secondary sources, reference works like contemporary authors. And then indeed, if you're still on speaking terms with your subject and you're not so exhausted by the mad sprint of deadline, you may want to go back and explore that person's work on your own time. But Obits makes it hard because the next day, you're on to somebody else, and the whole thing starts all over again.
What is an advance obit?
An advance obit is just as it sounds. It is an obituary that is written, as we say, on a pre-need basis while its subject is still alive. Obviously, what is missing from an advance obit is the where and when of the death. That, of course, will only get filled in when the subject slips out of this world and the advance obit becomes a breaking news obit. We prepare advance obits, and we have probably about 1,900 on file.
People you're just waiting for them to die.
Well, it's a Sisyphean job for Bill McDonald, the Times obituaries editor, because there are an awful lot of newsworthy undead, and our staff is relatively small. And
pre-dead.
Exactly. The pre-dead. The world for me divided for the 14 years I was on obits into the dead and the pre-dead. Those are the only two salient categories. But newspapers and we try to prepare advance obits for people whose body of work is so vast, so complex, and so important that we don't want to get caught short doing the frantic, caffeinated speed reading dance on deadline. Although, of course, since when somebody goes is in the lap of the gods, it does happen sometimes. But ideally, you've had the luxury of a week or sometimes 2 weeks to really read someone's body of work, see the films he or she made, whatever. Really think deeply, interview secondary sources, sometimes even interview your subject if he or she is in good shape and willing. And
that's an awkward call to make, I would imagine. I mean, what would you say if you're calling up someone in his 90s?
It is true that there is absolutely no Emily Post for the situation that basically boils down to, hi, you don't know me, I'm cold calling you. We know you're going to die relatively soon. We'd like to talk to you, and then put it where a couple of million people can see it. So I rely on a wonderful euphemism from the great mid-century Times obit writer Alden Whitman, and it has helped me many a time. He would call people up and say, this is Whitman from the Times. We're updating your biographical file. And then people can assimilate as much as they can psychologically handle. They know what it is.
Right. But that's a lovely way to phrase it.
Exactly. And I did that to a wonderful woman. I wish I could tell you what she had done, but we're not permitted to. But she had invented something really great that changed 20th century culture. And someday, I hope a long time from now, you will read about her. But she was and is already well into her 90s. She's now 95, 96. So I called her up maybe a year ago, very delicately. This is Fox of the Times. We're updating your biographical file. To which she chirped gaily, oh, you mean you're writing my obituary? So some people are down with it.
That's excellent. So it works out that you have obits in various kind of areas, right? The scientists, the inventors, the public figures, the diplomats, et cetera. And I know you have one for books. And maybe this is a very indelicate question, but you don't work here anymore, so perhaps you'll be willing to answer. But were there or are there writers that you really wanted to write about?
Absolutely. And we obit writers, both for the breaking news daily obits that are done on deadline and for the long-term advance ones, we are paid to be generalists and come off the bench and be quick studies in any field. And I've literally done obits on belly dancers, underwater cartographers, the president of Estonia. Those are literally all ones I've done. But that said, the editors know it's in their interest to try to match a writer with things in his or her wheelhouse. So my academic training was in linguistics, and before that, I trained as a cellist. So they give me both daily obits and advance obits for the dead or pre-dead linguists and the dead or pre-dead classical musicians. And to some extent, because I was in the book review, dead or pre-dead writers as well.
And were there any writers that you especially enjoyed writing about?
I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you because the Times...
I'm pre-dead.
But the Times, as you know, is not permitted to comment on the content of any forthcoming news article. And if you think about it, an advance obit is the ultimate forthcoming news article. So in deference to my old section and to my present colleagues, I am going to seal my lips on that point.
Well, we're not allowed to do that with forthcoming books, really. So I will close with your not forthcoming book. It's out now. It's called Conan Doyle for the Defense, the true story of a sensational British murder, a quest for justice, and the world's most famous detective writer by Margalit Fox, out now. Margot, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Great to be back.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Tina Jordan joins us now to talk about this week's special Thrills and Chills issue. Tina, thanks for being here.
Sure.
So I love putting together a thrillers issue in the summer. Obviously, you were game to sort of oversee this issue. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the world of thrillers this season.
Well, I think, as often happens, like in tumultuous times, people turn to escapist reading and escapist TV watching and escapist movie watching. And we know from places like the Boston Public Library and the New York Public Library that thrillers are making up like 30% of their checked out books.
Wow.
Which is astonishing to me.
Well, at the top of the bestseller list, we still have a thriller now for 5 weeks straight. Bill Clinton and James Patterson's The President is Missing.
That doesn't surprise me. Does that surprise you?
I'm not shocked.
I'm not shocked either. I actually read that book and I don't know what I was expecting, but I enjoyed it.
Do you like thrillers in general?
I do. I love thrillers. And before I came in to talk to you here, I was trying to think to myself, what is it about them that appeals to me so much?
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, like a lot of people, it's a way to like plumb really deep fears I have, because a lot of these thrillers, they're set like in our houses and at work and when we're on vacation,
Mm-hmm.
all these places that we think of as safe.
Right.
And so we are sort of vicariously able to like work out our, I don't know, nervousness, watching this
our
happen
anxiety,
to other
our
people.
deepest fears. There are a lot of different kinds of thrillers.
Yeah.
You have the domestic thriller, the psychological thriller, psychological suspense, military thriller, action thriller, science fiction thriller. What am I missing?
Romance thriller.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's sort of strange to like wedge them into those little subgenres, because I think the bigger point is that obviously the range of human emotions can be captured in any genre, but they're just so compelling in thrillers because they get your adrenaline going.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I mean, I think that a great thriller, like a great suspense novel or procedural, the writer, when it's done very well, weaves in a lot of human psychology in
Yes.
there and a lot of very close observation about human behavior. You know, I mean, it's not quite a thriller, but, you know, Tana French, for example, or Kate Atkinson, Jackson Brody novel, those are more suspense. But like there is a lot of insight into sort of way people operate.
right. And I think a lot of thriller writers are and crime writers are looking at this very basic question about what makes somebody evil? What makes them a psychopath? Why do they kill? Like, are they born that way? Are they made? Like, that's sort of like at the heart of all these books. And the best writers do study psychology.
Well, also, I mean, are they all evil? Or are they also maybe just like us?
Sometimes they're just like us, you see.
So this year we have a new Megan Abbott novel, Give Me Your Hand. And I feel like she's sort of been building a real audience over the recent years. And I know you're a fan.
I'm a fan. She is channeling female rage. What she does is she looks at what happens to women, usually young women, in very specific hothouse atmospheres.
Right. Like she did gymnastics.
The world of gymnastics, the world of cheerleading. And in this one, she's in a very cutthroat, high-stakes university lab where two young female scientists are competing against one another. And she's just sort of looking at what happens when you put people together in situations like that, combustible situations,
so that's psychological insight into young women. Mm-hmm. What's your favorite Megan Abbott novel?
Oh my gosh, that is a tough one. I think I might like this new one, Give Me Your Hand, the best. And I think it's because I thought about being in academia and it's a world I know a little bit. And I just felt that she captured it so perfectly. Because people who are not in academia don't understand how high stakes it is. I mean, the characters in this novel, they're postdocs. They don't even have a position yet. And if academia is a pyramid, they're like at the bottom. They're just like scrabbling to get up.
One of the things that seems to be happening in the world of thrillers, and I think we kind of alluded to this earlier, is there's so much genre blending and genre crossing. And a lot of literary thrillers, I guess for lack of a better term, seem to be coming out in recent years where so-called literary writers are saying, like, why can't I do this too? Or take aspects of a traditional thriller and incorporate, like weave that into.
Sure. I mean, isn't that what Kate Atkinson is doing? I mean, we used her name. John Banville writes them under another name.
Who are your favorite thriller writers?
Oh my gosh, that's really hard. I think my all-time favorite right now, series-wise, is Lee Child, because I have such a crush, like so many women, on Jack Reacher. And I just love those books.
Well, you got to talk to Lee Child on a special bonus episode of the Book Review Podcast this week. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But first, tell us about the Jack Reacher novels and what distinguishes them.
What distinguishes them is that the main character, Jack Reacher, if there's anybody out there who hasn't read a Reacher novel, he's completely, he's not tethered by anything. He's a retired military policeman. We really never know where he gets his money from and how he can just hitchhike around the country with a toothbrush in his pocket, solving crimes. He's almost like a mythic Old West character. He's not an alcoholic, depressed, morose detective.
Like so many of them are.
Like so many of them are, right?
He's not worn down by this world.
Right. He's not worn down by this world.
One other thing in this issue that I really loved, which you did together with a graphic artist, which was to create a kind of global map of thrillers. And I think for people who think of thrillers as a very American genre or think about it in terms of, Gone Girl and The Girl on the Train, this shows us a very different portrait of thrillers, where they're written, where they come from, where they take place.
Right. And I talked a lot to Marilyn Stasio, our crime writer, because she's interested in thrillers written around the world too. And I started to read them, and I started to realize how many there are now in translation from Chile, from Thailand, from, South Africa. And when you read them, because unlike certain genres, say literary fiction, setting is not so important, but it's really important in a thriller and a crime novel.
All right.
And so you're there,
I've got to just draw a picture for our listeners who are not necessarily looking at this great thriller map, All the World's a Crime, because what you did was you actually took a map of the world and continent by continent showed us where different novels are set or written or where the author's from. How did you do this?
Where they're set. And I tried in all cases to, if there were more than one good example, I tried to use the example where the author was from that country.
So give us some examples. Maybe let's look at the continent of Africa.
Africa is really interesting because I had read the #1 ladies detective agency novels by Alexander McCall Smith as they had come out. But I didn't really realize that there were other interesting series set there.
Well, where is that one set?
Botswana.
Okay.
Set in Botswana. So I'm going to butcher some of these names, but I discovered a series set in Ghana by someone named Kwai Kartey, Quartey. I loved those books.
What are the names of some of them?
Children of the Street is the one that I recommend people start with.
Okay.
And there was a South African thriller writer named Jassy McKenzie who has a series set in Johannesburg. And I'm recommending the one called Random Violence. And the more I just started to look, the more I was like, there's series set in Zimbabwe, in Morocco, everywhere.
So we've heard a lot about Nordic noir.
Right.
I bet you had fun with Scandinavia.
I had a lot of fun with Scandinavia, and basically it was impossible, Although I did find only one novel set in Greenland. And I don't know if you remember Peter Haig's Smilla's Sense of Snow.
Yes.
Yeah. That caused grief to the map maker because I had to keep to explain to him that it's owned by Denmark. So Greenland had to go under Denmark, which was
interesting.
Confusing. But yes, it's incredibly difficult to choose, when you're looking at the Scandinavian countries.
I don't want to suggest that all Scandinavian countries are alike because I know that they aren't.
Right.
But is there, as a reader, were you able to kind of distinguish, let's say, the Danish thriller from the Norwegian?
Well, let me tell you, they're all dark.
Yes.
And the Norwegian ones are the darkest of all. Now, I don't know if that's because more of Norway is above the Arctic Circle and it is dark there more, but those are bleak.
So that's Joe Nesbo territory.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite Joe Nesbo?
I didn't actually use him for Norway because I discovered somebody I liked better and named, I'm going to butcher this too, Jørgen Brekke, Brekke. And his books are set in Trondheim, which is, I think, pretty far up the Norwegian coast. And I read one called The Fifth Element, which I loved.
What's that about?
Murder, as always, and a beleaguered detective who's from
a depressed alcoholic.
Yeah, the depressed alcoholic, right.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the thriller writers you talked to this week on our bonus episode.
That was so interesting because I had in the studio separately Lee Child, Lisa Scottolini, Lisa Gardner, Megan Abbott, and Meg Gardner. And I didn't really know what to expect. I was talking to them about process. And what surprised me the most is how differently each one of them approaches writing.
The theme of the episode is
the art of writing a thriller.
And this was coincided with something called Thriller Fest. What is that?
Thriller Fest is the annual gathering of thriller writers that happens every summer in New York City at the Grand Hyatt.
What do people do there? Who goes?
Well, they all go. Every major thriller writer goes, and they have workshops. Somebody from the FBI will be conducting a workshop telling them about the latest forensic technology, because they have to stay really up on technology, as you might imagine. I mean, great thrillers need smart characters because you're not going to solve a crime without smarts, but they can't ignore technology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big part of what they study at Thriller Fest.
That goes all the way back to the very beginnings of detective and thriller writing, that you have to be up on the latest in forensic.
You do. And it strikes me that there's a lot of mentoring going on. Mm-hmm. It seems like a very tight-knit community, and a lot of the more famous writers are actively helping and working with the younger ones.
And is it all writers who go, or are there readers and fans as well?
I think it's all writers. It's all writers. I mean, I'm sure there are hangers on there. I asked what it was like. I think I asked Meg Gardner, what's it like, to be in a room or be around other people who spend all their time trying to come up with the perfect way to kill someone.
Right.
And she was like, hey, they're really nice people. And then she told me an anecdote about being in a cafe and discussing how a murder was going to unspool with somebody else, and then, we're going to give him just so much of this to knock him out. And when he's almost unconscious, and there was somebody sitting near her who, thought she was for real. Mm-hmm. And, he did not call the police, but he did get up and yell.
All right. To give our listeners just a sneak preview of what they can expect on this bonus episode, tell us what was the question you were most eager to ask and of whom? And in what room?
I was eager to ask Lee Child how he choreographed his fight scenes because Reacher is so famous for like taking on 4, 5, 6 people and like winning. And when you read them, it's almost like watching a ballet, except for with lots of blood and broken bones and dead people at the end. And Reacher is always victorious. And it turns out that Lee Child had to fight his way in and out of his neighborhood every day to go to school, and he was a big kid. His parents were very upwardly mobile. They got him into a good school. He was a bright kid, but he said that was like having a target on his back in his neighborhood. Fought his way out and in every day. And so he literally like walked me through what you do if you're walking down the sidewalk, if you're Reacher or Lee Child, and you see 4 people coming at you.
Did you have to fight him?
Oh, no. Have you ever met him? He's huge. He's like 6'6".
Yes.
He also told me that he drinks scary amounts of coffee every day.
So Lee Child is Jack Reacher.
He is Jack Reacher, I think.
That's the answer. All right. That and more on your bonus episode. And Tina, thanks so much for being here.
Sure.
Our critics, Dwight Garner, Paul Sagal, and Jennifer Salai, join us now to talk about what they're reading and criticizing. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's start with Paul. What did you read this week and review?
I reviewed a book by Thomas Clerk called Interior, and as I was reviewing it, to give you a sense of it, so it's this book about this writer who spent 3 years annotating all of his possessions, and if I have a sort of predisposition to a book, it's always to something that shouldn't be a book or shouldn't be literature. And like this book, the minute I saw it, I read the premise, I was like, yes, this is for me. Something so eccentric, something a little strange. Does it work? And it kind of works. I think that he's in conversation with a lot of French writers and conceptual artists who have asked similar sorts of questions about like how do we describe the self, right? Like do we have to delve into ourselves emotionally? Do we have to write a memoir? Or can you really write a life by saying, these are my socks. This is my bathtub. It takes 13 minutes to fill. It takes 27 steps from my couch to my fridge. And so it's strange. But what was interesting to me also as I was reviewing it is that I felt, that there's this new genre of writing about the self that's happening on the internet. This sort of flourishing of lists of these people like sort of publishing their diaries. Here's my money diary. Here's my restaurant diary. Here's my beauty ritual. And I consume all of this content all of the time.
Like talking about themselves,
I can't
like
get enough
through the
of it.
lens of what they own and
That's
what
right.
they
and
like
like in terms
and
of
what they
objects,
keep.
in terms of this. And it's sort of like I've felt that in the last couple of years, the personal essay has not gone completely out of fashion, but it's been questioned. People wrestled with it a little bit more. And instead, this other sort of genre has risen up, and it just felt this book Interior can feel so French and so foreign, but it also felt like such a cousin to everything that I'm consuming all the time these days. And this new way of telling the story of the self, this new way of understanding and even refracting trauma, right? So as you're reading the book, you're sort of trying to piece apart a story. What is the story here? So, okay, we're walking through your apartment, we're seeing your bedroom, we're seeing your study, these are your papers, these are your shoes, this memory of this. And as you're reading, you suddenly realize that, at the heart of this story are these ghosts, are these sorts of deaths that he is mourning, and he is looking at the world that he's been left in a sense.
Going back to the writing about things and writing about the self through the stuff that surrounds you, that's not just on the internet. You point out that that's happening in books as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's happening through a bunch of writers who also interestingly collaborate a lot together. Leanne Shapton wrote a beautiful book about a relationship with a title so long that I will muddle it if I do it here. But it's a story of a fictional couple's breakup told in the form of an auction catalog. Heidi Julowitz's book Folded Clock, which is a diary, really sort of is structured around the appearance of these certain talismanic objects. Sheila Heti, another person who has collaborated with both of them in this book called Women in Clothes,
right?
Really, talked to a bunch of women, sort of getting a sense of their lives and the lives of their mothers and the lives of their friends through objects. Your mother's purse, these handful of hairpins, this dress you used to wear.
Why do you think we're doing that? I mean, what's the impulse?
I mean, I think there are a few different things. One thing I think I raise in the review is that it feels nostalgic. We live online a lot. And I think that there's something about tethering ourselves to the world again that can feel really necessary and can feel really important. So there's that contrast. The other way I think is that as people have been thinking a lot about memoirs and authenticity and truth and stuff like that, these questions are important, but they've muddied it, And I think that there can be something easier or more purer, you feel, in sort of getting the story of somebody's life through these concrete objects. And but these are just sort of my guesses right now. I do know I enjoy reading them, which is a separate question.
Is it something about consumerism too, about the fact that we just have so much stuff and that we think that stuff says something about us?
No, I mean, yeah, I'm sure on some level. I think maybe more than consumerism, I think people are thinking about taste, and the way that we try to sort of. But I don't think so. I was about to go someplace where I don't think these books are judgy about that. I don't think that they're shaming people for consumerism necessarily. I think that they are tender about our fantasies for ourselves and our desires for ourselves. And sometimes the way that we dress and the things we own and the things we keep for some people are very, very powerful ways that they express some of these feelings.
It's like Marie Kondo, but literature.
Yeah. But Marie Kondo's whole thing is that she's full of love and reverence for objects. So yeah, and I think she's actually a cousin to a lot of this stuff, the way we feel about what we possess. And does it possess us in turn?
So your book, Jen, was also oddly about an object, a consumer object, one that goes away. Tell us about what the book you wrote about.
Yes, so the book is called Jell-O Girls, and it's by Ali Rowbottom. And it's sort of a combination of family memoir and cultural history. And so Rowbottom is the descendant of the Jell-O fortune. Her great uncle, I believe, bought the business in the late 1800s and then sold it in the 20s. And so when he sold it, he got something like $67 million for it. So that's a lot of money to fund several generations of heirs. So the book itself, I mean, it's very interesting because it's one of these things where I have to say that right at the beginning, into this family memoir, she also brings up the town of Leroy, where Jell-O was long produced. And she looks at the way in which these girls who several years ago started exhibiting Tourette's-like symptoms, like twitching. And at the time, everybody was flummoxed. I mean, they weren't sure what was going on. And, she brings in that history into her own family history and then ties it to the cultural history of Jell-O. And so right at the beginning, I'm thinking,
Watch
oh my
it
God,
jiggle.
how is this going to work?
Mm-hmm.
And to her credit, it actually really does. I mean, she's super ambitious in this book. I mean, she really tries to draw connections, and sometimes they're not always totally convincing, but, the way in which she sort of links together Jell-O as a product that sort of really tried to not only shape, but also respond to the changing roles of women, and then also several generations of women in her own family, and then also what happened to these girls in Leroy. It's just a sort of really strange and remarkable book, I think.
There was a line at the beginning of your review. I like to live in kind of willful ignorance of the origin of what I eat, but where...
Do you...
I mean, I'm not like a regular Jell-O eater, if that's what you're asking, but where you described that it's ground up flesh and bones.
Wait,
yeah.
Jell-O was ground up flesh and bones?
Gelatin. Yeah. It's made the
horse
gelatin.
hooves.
Did you make any during the process of reading
Well,
this
it's so
book
funny,
and writing
actually,
about it?
because I have to say my reaction, even though I feel like I found out maybe as a teenager that that's what Jell-O was. I don't think I ever thought about what it was. And it was when I was a teenager. And at the time, trying not to eat meat, and I was kind of disgusted. And now I eat meat again. And then reading this book, even though the book does not paint Jell-O in a nice light, at the end of it, I was like, I haven't had Jell-O in a long time. I kind of would like a Jell-O fruit salad, which I haven't had
thinking
yet.
the same thing. Actually.
But yeah, that was sort of my. There was
There's
sort
like
of
that
a nostalgia.
ambrosia, truly one of the weirdest salads of like mid-century America,
yeah.
right? It's like
Is that the one with
Big
the
deal where I come from.
It's got fruit
Fruits.
and marshmallows and
that I don't know
Jell-O,
about that
shaved
one.
coconut, all
It's
kinds
actually
of things.
kind of good.
It's delicious.
Yeah. So
A little shaved bone and coconut.
That's right.
right. So yeah, Jell-O not vegetarian. I think they might have some. I mean, they've branched out into sort of different products, so they might have different. They have like a natural version. I'm not
Is there
sure
a
how
vegan Jell-O out there?
Yeah, I don't know if Jell-O makes it, but I'm sure that there's like a vegan gelatin dessert out there.
But one thing I loved in your review is that you do discuss at a certain point how it became an emblem for a certain kind of femininity. The food, right? Like I think you use the word dainty.
Yes.
And it's, it was like clean and dainty and low
modern,
calorie
yes.
and modern
Yeah.
and quick.
Yeah, it does feel like a mid-century modern kind of food.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that, she also sort of goes through how at one point it was really sort of dominating the culture. And then it really fell out of style when it became too associated with, suburban domesticity, essentially. And so, this
is the perils of womanhood, man. Out of charred bone and something produced this dainty object that falls out of fashion.
Exactly.
All right, I think the common thread here is nostalgia and things out of fashion, so which leads us to Dwight's book.
I reviewed this week Candy, which is now 60 years old, the satire of Voltaire's Candide, and a sort of satire also of smutty books written by Terry Southern, who of course wrote the screenplays for Dr. Strangelove and Easy Rider and was the sort of original new journalist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He wrote this book when he was quite young, along with a friend, Mason Hoffenberg, and they were just poor and funny and dumb and young and wanted to write something and make some money. And they wrote it together, Candy. They sent it back and forth in chapters to each other in the mail, and each wrote a chapter. And I read it when I was young, and it influenced me in the sense that its humor is so wild and so smart that it was very attractive to me when I was young. And I was scared to read it again, which I did for this piece.
Because you were afraid you weren't going to like it as much.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, I wasn't going to review it at all, but I had a book set up to review last week. I won't name the title, but it was kind of a first novel. If it wasn't a first novel, it might as well have been a first novel. And
it was a first novel.
and the writer is unknown. And the one position you don't want to be in as a book critic is saying to the readers, this thing you're never going to hear about, well, it's terrible. So, why bother? And so I figured, I needed something else quickly. Here's Candy. And I'm so glad I read it because it was the most enjoyable reading experience I've had for a little while.
It turns out you are just like you were in your tastes.
I haven't changed at all. I still like Jell-O. I still like candy. But, one of the things I say in my review is one of the reasons it still lives that it's so loose-limbed. I mean, it's just Terry Southern's other work has gotten a little bit overthought over time, and its humor is a bit strained. And Candy is just, is written fast, but it's a deadline production that works because it was a deadline production. I kind of make a small case for it is still readable during our Me Too moment in the sense that the men in it are such fatuous beasts. I mean, I say in the review, they're fit for nothing but gibbering at the moon. But, it's black satire. I mean, it's satire. Candy is no feminist paragon. Her one goal in life seems to be to lose her virginity. And the men, of course, are happy to be there to assist her, even though the book is all about the protracted ways in which she does not lose her virginity as the book goes on. But A, Candy is hilarious. B, it sort of reads like a rocket. C, there's a wild sex scene every 30 pages. One forgets, actually, when one's a young reader. I don't know if you all were this way, but as a young reader, the books you read, the kind of trashy books your parents read, there's a sex scene in them every 30, 40 pages in like this metronomic clock. And you realize that's not such a bad way to structure a book, certain kind of book, and you kind of swing as if from vine to vine in Candy.
The Sidney Sheldon School of Criticism,
or
right
the
here.
Mario Puzo, or I read worse.
I read the worst. Oh, my God.
But the sex scenes, every other chapter in this book, essentially, there's a sex scene, or an almost sex scene, I call it.
But they're also silly, right? Like
they're silly.
They're not just to turn you on. Like they're actually.
But they do turn you on a little bit. They're not utterly fatuous.
Yeah.
I mean, they kind of work also. The most famous line from the book is she picks up this hunchback on Grove Street in the West Village and brings him back to her apartment. He basically wants nothing to do with her, but she ends up screaming, "Give me your hump." And that's the most famous line in the novel. So anyway, my recommendation for this week is Candy by Terry Southern and Mason Hoffenberg.
All right, here's a question for Jan and Pearl. Are you guys also afraid to turn back and reread books that you loved when you were younger, or do you have no problem doing
I have
that?
like an actual practice. Like if I'm not so busy reading, what I do is for every new book I read, I go back and reread a book.
Really?
Yeah. So I keep...
It's like a chaser?
Yeah, but it's also just like I have this like dream of myself as a reader just to know, like that old Flaubert idea, just like the dream of knowing like 6 books really, really well. And
What
it's
are your
hard.
6 books?
I'm not, like that's so boring.
That's
but,
a whole other podcast.
But no, but it's this idea of like, like we're just in the business of reading and then reading around the books, and it can just feel like you're just activating that one muscle, right? And when you reread, that's when you actually get to sort of, I don't know, at least for me. Like,
And have you ever reread something and thought,
had a
my
completely
God,
different-
who was I?
I have a lot of it with, I mean, like I'm so not new in this, but like all of Salinger's stuff, really, like I've gone back to it.
Oh,
and
I
just
hated it from the beginning.
I didn't hate it. I think I was like, I
hated it.
felt very much like I wanted to understand what being an American was, right? And so I was just like, there's these books about,
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I read them very anthropologically, and I thought they were interesting. I thought they were important. And going back and rereading some of that stuff has been very, even the stuff I responded to has been a little awkward, and but
Yeah.
What about you?
Not much. I mean, I think there's a little bit of fear. I feel like there's a part of me that feels like if I went back to stuff that I really loved when I was younger, I'm not sure if I would respond to it in the same way. And so I sort of want to keep it pristine in my mind as something that was really meaningful to me back then and was necessary to who I was. I mean, I don't know if I've changed that much, but I don't know. I think that there is, and there's also the time thing. I mean, there's that.
Well, Pamela, you wrote a book about this, essentially, going back and looking at books. So what was the book that shocked you the most when you went back, that you had the most sort of dramatic response to?
I don't like to reread, honestly, but because of the time reason, and there's so much still that I want to read that I haven't read. What I did do when I started writing about this book of books is I ordered all of the books that I no longer owned that were in my Bob that I wanted to write about.
Your Bob is your book of books.
Bob is my book of books. And because for a long time, I didn't throw away any books, but I fell under the unfortunate influence of my husband, who is a big thrower-outer. And I got rid of things that I now regret. So I had to go back and I needed to find not just those books, but the editions of the books that I had.
Oh, wow.
I had to find, the exact cover.
Wow.
Yes. Preferably like the same year. And what I ended up finding was it's sort of parallel to the book of books itself, which is that it wasn't actually about what was inside those books. It was about what that reading experience and the time that I read it and the way that it influenced me at that time evoked. There was really only one instance in which I got sucked back in and ended up completely rereading something to my chagrin, which was a Spalding Gray book, Morning, Noon, and Night, which I hadn't read since it had come out, and inadvertently got drawn back in. But in general, I'm not a huge rereader because there's just still so much left to read.
I know.
We'll end on that mournful note. Dwight, Carl, Jen, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.